We continue now in this vitally important opening section of John's glorious statement regarding the revelation of Jesus Christ. We are in chapter 1. Very important for us to understand chapter 1 if we're to get our bearings for the rest of the chapters to follow. Now we're also entering into that new section, the first major division after the introduction in the book of Revelation. We're in the first section that deals with John's becoming in the Spirit. Remember, the four major divisions of Revelation are governed by these four in the Spirit statements. And so let's now look into this and see what we can learn. We're ready for Roman numeral 3, John's initial vision, which occurs from chapter 1, verse 12 through verse 20. Now, capital A is Christ appears to John. Remember, in 1:10, John hears a loud voice behind him commanding him to write. And remember also that in Revelation 1:1, it opens by saying the revelation of Jesus Christ. And so it's important to note that Christ is the one who's here directing John to write, since this is Jesus' revelation that he's bringing into the world. Now, interestingly, the same voice that speaks here, which is the voice of Jesus, speaks again in Revelation 4:1. In the next in the Spirit vision, there we read, "The first voice which I heard, like the sound of a trumpet speaking with me, said, 'Come up here.' And then he was in the Spirit, and he went into heaven." But notice it's the first voice which he heard, like the sound of a trumpet, which is referring back to chapter 1 in the vision we're about ready to study. Well, now in Revelation 1, verses 12 through 17, we read these words. "And I turned to see the voice that was speaking with me, and having turned, I saw 7 golden lampstands, and in the middle of the lampstands one like a son of man, clothed with a robe reaching down to the feet, and girded across his breast with a golden girdle. And his head and his hair were white like white wool, like snow, and his eyes were like a flame of fire." Now here, this is reflecting Daniel 7 and the vision of the Son of Man that Daniel has back then. There Daniel sees one who is dressed like a son of man. And so you can see the impact of Daniel's prior imagery on John's current imagery. But there's a difference. Whereas Daniel distinguishes the Son of Man and the Ancient of Days, John, as is his typical fashion in the use of the Old Testament, John merges the Son of Man vision and the Ancient of Days vision and applies this vision to Jesus Christ because, of course, Jesus Christ is God. John merges the imagery in Daniel 7, verses 9 and 10. He does that in Revelation 1, verses 13 through 15, to present the Son of Man. Now, John continues here, therefore, a high view of Christ. Revelation is very distinctly Christian book with a high view of Christ. And here, the imagery of the Ancient of Days is applied to the Son of Man, who is Jesus Christ. Here, Christ is also dressed with a robe that reaches down to his feet and a special belt. Revelation 1:14 said, "Clothed in a robe reaching to the feet and girded across his chest with a golden sash." Now, when we read in Exodus 28, verse 4 about the high priest, it says that he had a robe and a tunic of checkered work and a turban and a sash. Now, the Greek word John uses in Revelation chapter 1 is podere, and it means a robe that reaches down to the feet. Podia is the word for feet, and so this podere is a robe that reaches down to the feet. And therefore, what we have here is the same word occurring in Revelation chapter 1, verse 14, as occurs in Exodus 28, verse 4, 25, verse 7, and other texts that speak of the long to the feet robe that is worn by the high priest. Now remember, this is important. Remember the benediction of Revelation 1, verses 4 and 5. Christ is presented there as a prophet, priest, and king. As a priest, Christ dies for our sins. So consequently, when he finally appears to John here in this first vision, he highlights his priestly work in conquering death. Therefore, we read in Revelation 1, verses 17 and 18, Jesus saying, "I did become dead, and lo, I am living. And then later he appears as the slain Lamb of God. So what is happening here is Jesus appears before John dressed like a high priest who has died for our sins. And therefore what we're going to find out is we're already beginning to discern some very important realities here. Christ's high priestly garments show that he is the ultimate high priest, and he has caused the superseding of the old lineage of high priests from Aaron. Jesus is now the high priest. There's no longer the lineage of high priesthood that should continue after this time. And also, he does so with eyes of flaming fire. This high priest, the ultimate high priest, has come to judge the temple, the high priest, and the high priestly system with his wrath, because they are the ones that rejected him. So Jesus appears as a high priest with flaming eyes to bring devastation upon the earthly high priests who have failed to do that which God is pleased with. Now, capital B, Christ walks among the churches. Verse 13 says, "In the middle of the lampstands I saw one like a son of man." Now, in verse 20, he explains, or that is, Christ explains, that the 7 lampstands are the 7 churches. Therefore, what's going on in this vision is Christ is seen among the 7 churches who are suffering first century Christians. He's seen among the 7 churches. He is there in their midst, and they must take comfort in that he is with them. So as Revelation opens, John, writing to these churches that are in tribulation, Revelation 1:9, these churches are to know that that Jesus, the transfigured Son of Man, in the ultimate robes of the high priest, he is there with them. They need not defect back into Judaism with its earthly high priest. They can stay with this new ultimate high priest. And so significantly, we have this, in the Old Testament, you have the candelabra, which was a 7-pronged lampstand that had 7 lamps that connected into one base. There was one lamp which had 7 branches, in other words, in the Old Testament candelabra. But here, what we have is there are 7 separate candles, and they are taking the place of the one candlestick of the Old Testament. And there's lessons to be learned from this. And the first is this, that Christ's church is taking over for the Old Covenant people, Israel. Christ's church, according to Paul in Galatians 6:16, is the Israel of God. According to Paul in Galatians 3:29, it is the seed of Abraham. So what we have here is the singular candelabra of the Old Covenant, signifying the singular people of Israel, becoming 7 distinct candlestands that represent each of the 7 churches that are being written to and are therefore a representative of the whole Church of Jesus Christ. So no longer do you have one candelabra that represents the one people of Israel, but you've got multiple lampstands that represent the church that is now going out into the world as separate individual entities. And so no longer are they to be considered a part of Israel as one nation, but now they're from many nations. Now later, we'll read in Revelation in chapter 5, verse 9, and 7, verse 9, that the church is composed of every nation, tribe, people, and tongue. And so in Revelation, we're going to find, as we work our way through it, that many of the images of Old Testament Israel, of the Old Covenant economy, are being transformed by John, and in fact, they are generally being universalized, moving out from the single people Israel to the universal Christian church of Jesus Christ. And this is by design, because that is what is happening with the closing of the Old Covenant economy. Now, Roman numeral 4, Jesus' 7 letters. Now, in chapter 2 and 3, we have the very famous passage that deals with the 7 letters to the 7 churches. In Revelation 2 and 3, we traditionally know these as the 7 letters to 7 churches. However, in just a moment, I'm going to note that they are something a little more potent than 7 letters to 7 churches. So let us begin by noticing capital A, the significance of the 7 letters. Before the judgments begin in Revelation 6, when the slain lamb begins opening the 7 sealed scroll, Christ is sending letters to His church, those people who have left Israel and have united themselves with Him, as well as Gentiles who have been adopted into the family of God through the ministry and the testimony of the Christians of the first century. And so before those judgments begin, in chapter 6, what we're finding here is that John sees a vision of Christ among the churches as their defender, as their protector. Before they begin, therefore, he writes to these individual churches, and he commands John at the beginning of each message, to the angel of the church of X, write. In other words, to each church, to the angel of the church of this church, that church, or the other, write. Now, though these are in letter format, and they are truly letters, they really read more like proclamations. While Christ shows He is with them, He's also showing them that He is examining them and reproving them and warning them. They need to know He's with them, but He's not with them detached from their own moral conduct and spiritual realities. He is there to protect, to be sure, but He's also protecting them by examining and warning them to turn from their defections. For example, in Revelation 2, verses 2 and 3, we read these words, Jesus speaking, of course, I know your deeds and your toil and perseverance, but I have this against you. He knows what they're suffering. He knows their good deeds, but they need to do better. The churches are being tested, and he urges them to hold on. Remember, a sub-theme in the book of Revelation is the call to perseverance. For example, in each of the 7 letters, we hear something on this order, as in Revelation 2, verse 7. To him who overcomes, I will grant this, that, or the other. In all of the 7 letters, there's the urging to overcome, and Christ will grant them this thing or that, according to which letter it is. Again, an important sub-theme, an important point to be made by John in Revelation is to encourage faithfulness in the face of trial. The Christians are being tried by the Jews in persecution, and they are being tried by the Romans in persecution, and many are defecting, but Jesus is there to warn them, do not defect. Patience, my friends, my loved ones. He calls them to patience throughout. Now, capital B, the integrity of the 7 letters. The 7 letters are integral parts of the book of Revelation. They're not some kind of later addition. Now, many of the form critics and many of the liberal-minded commentators and scholars say that these 7 letters appear to be a result of later editing of the book of Revelation, and they're simply imposed on the beginning of Revelation. They weren't really a part of the book when John or whoever originally wrote it. But when we look at it, we can see that that can't possibly be the case. The 7 letters are carefully integrated into the book of Revelation. They're not just pasted on it from outside. They are carefully integrated into it and part and parcel to what Revelation is doing. And let's notice in this regard, first, the letters respond to John's commission to write. Chapter 1, verse 11. Write in a book what you see and send it. And then in chapter 2:1 he says, to the angel of the church, write. In chapter 2:8, to the angel of the church, X, write. And on throughout. And so you see in chapter 1, the introduction to Revelation, John receives a command to write, and then that command is reiterated in each of the 7 letters or proclamations to the angel of the church, X, write. And so we see that it very clearly is a part of the whole structure of the book, feeding off of what has already been stated in chapter 1. So chapters 2 and 3 are the letters that flow out of John's command to write in chapter 1. And secondly, the letters' headings reflect portions of chapter 1. Not only do they respond to the command to write, but they begin reflecting images we see in chapter 1. For example, the letter to the church at Ephesus reflects chapter 1, verses 13 and 16. In 2:1, Revelation 2:1, we read that he speaks of the one who is, quote, holding the 7 stars in his right hand, who is walking in the midst of the 7 lampstands. That's precisely out of the vision of the first chapter. And it's picked up here in the letters. So it's connecting the first chapter and the letters. In the letter to Smyrna, it reflects chapter 1, verses 17 and 18, which say, well, let me read chapter 2, verse 8, the first and the last who did become dead and did live, clearly reflecting chapter 1, verses 17 and 18. And we see this over and over again in the 7 letters, that portions of the first chapter are picked up and adapted into the letters in chapters 2 and 3. They are a part and parcel to the book of Revelation. Another line of evidence, number 3, the pattern of 7 fits with Revelation's larger narrative. A familiar feature of Revelation is his use of 7s. We have these 7 letters now. These 7 letters comport with the 7 seals, 7 trumpets, 7 bowls, 7 thunders. We see a being with 7 heads. We see a being with 7 horns. We see one with 7 diadems. We read of 7 angels, 7 plagues, 7 mountains, 7 kings. On and on we could go. The number 7 is all throughout the book of Revelation. So the 7 letters to the 7 church fit into the larger narrative. And then fourthly, the promises of the letters appear in the conclusion of Revelation. For example, in Revelation 2:7, Christ promises access to the tree of life. Well, lo and behold, when you read through to chapter 22, verses 2 and 14, we're presented with the tree of life that people now have access to. In chapter 2, verse 11, there's the promise of protection from the second death. Lo and behold, when we read in Revelation 20, verse 6, and verse 13, and 21, verse 8, his followers are protected from the second death. In the letter in chapter 2, verse 28, we see the promise of the morning star. Well, when we look in Revelation 22, verse 16, we see that God gives the morning star to these people. On and on we could go. The point is, these letters are integrated into the whole structure of the book of Revelation, even appearing in its conclusion. And finally, against the critics who would say that the 7 letters were pasted onto the book and tacked to it without being fully integrated into it, I would note number 5, no textual evidence suggests the letters were ever separate from the book. If Revelation has been edited and the letters added later, why do we not have even one text that has been found that is without the 7 letters and shows that the book of Revelation first appeared without them and that they were only later added to them? No ancient manuscript evidence shows the book of Revelation without the 7 letters. They are integral to the book of Revelation. Well, capital C, the historicity of the letters. And this is going to be important as we deal with our fellow Christians in the modern world here and things that are thought by them. Revelation chapter 2 and 3 is misunderstood by many evangelicals and particularly dispensationalists. They claim that each of the 7 letters, in the particular order they're given, are prophetic foreviews of all of church history. That if you look at each of the 7 letters, there will be a characterization of church history, and then the next phase of church history to the next phase until the very end. For example, the New Scofield Reference Bible says, the letters are prophetic as disclosing 7 phases of the spiritual history of the church from, say, AD 96 to the end. These messages do present an exact foreview of the spiritual history of the church, and in this precise order. Ephesus gives the general state at the date of the writing. Smyrna, the period of the great persecutions. Pergamos, the church settled down in the world where Satan's throne is after the conversion of Constantine, say AD 316. Thyatira is the papacy, developed out of the Pergamos state. Baalism developed out of the Pergamos state. Baalism, or worldliness, and Nicolaitanism, priestly assumption, having conquered, Sardis becomes the Protestant Reformation, whose works were not fulfilled. Philadelphia is whatever bears clear testimony to the word and the name of the time of the self-satisfied profession represented by Laodicea. That's what these 7 letters are about, projecting church history in this exact order with these particular characterizations. This is as badly mistaken as it is popularly and widely held. Notice first, Revelation 2 and 3 refers to historical first century churches. In the first place, John mentions the specific ancient historical cities in which they dwell: Ephesus, Smyrna, Laodicea, Philadelphia, etc. Those are known historical cities, and he is dealing with known churches of his day. Furthermore, John alludes to each church's history, environment, and spiritual condition. For example, the history of Ephesus. The letter to the church at Ephesus mentions that they are struggling with false apostles. There are people within the church claiming to be apostles. This is a historical problem that church faced. In their cultural environment, the church at Smyrna is being assailed by Jews, according to Revelation 2:9. On and on we could go. There are a lot of detailed things that are found in various technical studies of Revelation that are very helpful in this regard. These are real first century churches with their own issues. They're not symbols of later developing history. Then notice secondly, not only firstly does the Revelation 2 and 3 passage refer to the first century churches, but secondly, the order of the churches follow a known Roman postal road. Check a map in the back of your Bible and then trace from the first church to the last and see if it doesn't draw you a little looping circle. This is because that's a postal road that the runner would run on to take these letters to these 7 churches. Thirdly, the alleged foreview of church history is subjective. Is the New Scofield pattern objective? Is it what he says an exact foreview? Is it what he says in the precise order? Can all church history be summarized as the New Scofield Reference Bible claims? Do we really think the Smyrna era began in AD 316? What if it began in 317? This is too exacting and too constricting. This is simply not the case. So then, these observations forbid us to assume that John is intending an outline of church history. Again, he's writing to real first century Christians. Capital D, the structure of the letters. Firstly, let's notice the letters follow a general 7-fold pattern. The outline of the first letter of Ephesus will serve as an illustration. And I'll give you that outline, and you'll notice that basically it can be read into the others. First, the salutation, to the angel of. Then, identification, the one who holds the 7 stars in his right hand, the one who walks among the 7 golden lampstands says this. And then, praise. I know your deeds and your toil. And then criticism, but I have this against you. And then warning, or else I'm coming to you to remove your lampstand. And then exhortation, he who has an ear to hear, let him hear. And then promise, seventhly, to him who overcomes, I will do this, that, or the other. This is the general 7-fold pattern of the letters. However, secondly, we must note, the letters show 2 breaches of the general pattern. Remember, I did say it was a general pattern. In the last 4 letters, the last 2 points of exhortation and promise are reversed. And so they're not in the same order. They're still there, but in a different order. And furthermore, Smyrna and Philadelphia received no criticism. They're the only 2 churches of the 7 that are not criticized at all. But that is the general structure there, at least. Capital E, an important focus in 2 of the letters. We're not going to study each letter in detail due to our time constraints, but significantly 2 of the letters that are the 2 churches that have no criticism provide important material that help us understand the meaning and purpose of the book of Revelation. Since Israel's judgment is Revelation's theme, it's significant that Smyrna and Philadelphia, who were not rebuked at all, are being tormented, being slandered, being brought to court by Jews. Let's notice first the Smyrnaean Jews. In Revelation 2, verses 9 and 10, the Jews at Smyrna. There we read, I know your tribulation and your poverty, but you are rich, and the blasphemy of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Do not fear what you're about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to cast some of you into prison. Now notice in the first place, as we indicated earlier in the introduction, Christ denies the Jews the right to the name Jew. Notice he says they say they're Jews, but they're not. In other words, Christ is saying they think they're Jews, but in my opinion, as the Lord of God's people, they are not Jews. This is like Paul in Romans 2:28. He's not a Jew who is one outwardly, but who is one inwardly. Or Paul in Galatians 3:29. If you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. So Christ denies the Jews the right to the name Jew. Now, secondly, notice, small b, Christ notes that the Jews slander Christians. Now, when you read the text, it says the blasphemy of those who say they are Jews. But the word blasphemy speaks of legal slander as well as what we know of as blaspheming the name of God. Because in the first place, the term blasphemy is often used in antiquity of legal slander and bringing charges against someone. And then secondly, the context shows that the legal implications. He says, I know those who are slandering you. Behold, you will be soon cast into prison. Those who are charging you, bringing you to court with legal slander, are seeking to have you put into prison. So that's what's going on there. And then, small c, Christ charges their synagogues to be synagogues of Satan. This is very similar to a statement Christ makes to the Jews in John 8:44. Now the Gospel of John, and here's the revelation of John. In John 8:44, he says, you are of your father the devil. And here he's talking of the Jews as of the synagogue of Satan. Notice how similar the two phrases are, that the Jews are being condemned as having been overwhelmed by Satan and his desires. And that's why his judgment coming must befall them. And D, Christ sees the Jews behind the Roman authorities imprisoning of Christians. Now, here, remember I said the blasphemy is a legal slander that ends up getting Christians thrown into prison. Well, this matches the experience of Christianity in the book of Acts. For instance, we'll look, not only do we look at the book of Acts, but we see it anticipated in Jesus' own words in Matthew 10:7. In Matthew 10:17, he says, beware of men, for they will hand you over to the courts and scourge you in their synagogues, that's Jewish places of worship, and you will even be brought before governors and kings for my name's sake. Jesus is saying the Jews will scourge you in their synagogues and turn you over to governors and kings. Now, throughout Acts, we see that happening. And the reason we see that happening is because Jesus himself has warned that it will. Now, secondly, the Philadelphian Jews in Revelation 3, verse 9. Let's read that text just briefly. Behold, I will cause those of the synagogue of Satan, who say that they are Jews and are not, but lie. Behold, I will make them come and bow down at your feet, and to know that I have loved you. In addition to the statements we just saw dealing with the Smyrnaean Christians, we can add these two additional thoughts regarding the Jews and their judgment against the Christians. And the first is that the Jews are called liars. This is very important. Remember, Revelation is a courtroom drama. There are witnesses being called. There's testimony being given. And now the Jews are deemed to be liars. They have a non-court-worthy reference to their own being. You see, the Christians are the true Jews. They are the true people of God, not those who claim to be Jew, but the Christians who are indeed the true Jews. Now this matches with Paul's statement in Philippians 3:3, where Paul says, we are the true circumcision who worship in the Spirit of God and glory in Jesus Christ and put no confidence in the flesh. The Jews, you see, had a confidence in their fleshly circumcision. But Paul says, we are the true Jews if we worship Christ. And also, notice small b, the Jews will soon be humbled. And by that, I believe he's referring to their humiliation in AD 70. He says, I will make them to come and bow down at your feet and to know that I have loved you. The Jews are judging the Christians, hauling them into court, doing everything they can to disrupt the Christian witness, claiming that these Christians are not true Jews, they're not the true people of God, we are. And yet Jesus says, no, I will make them to be humbled in your sight. And he's talking about the humiliation of Israel in AD 70 when their temple was destroyed, when they could no longer offer sacrifices according to the Levitical code. Israel is about to be judged, and that's what the book of Revelation is about. Thank you.